Hello everyone! I'm pleased to be part of this nearly carbon-neutral conference, and I'd like to thank the organizers for their support. This presentation, under the title Les Génies du Nord, Selection and the Advocacy of an International Nordic Culture, is part of an ongoing research project on the concept Les Génies du Nord, the Northern Genius in Western Europe between the wars, funded by the Research Center for the Humanities in Athens. Following the general theme of this conference, my focus is centered on the Francophone Belgian artistic and literary journal Selection, published in Brussels and Antwerp between 1920 and 1933. I'll start with some general remarks on this publication. Selection was first published as a bulletin of artistic life in August 1920. A subtitle referring to its role as a gallery bulletin reporting on the activities of the Atelier d'Art Contemporain Selection, an art gallery run by André de Ridder and Paul Gustave van Hecke between 1920 and 1922 in Brussels. The gallery specialized in modern art, furniture, and interior design. Selection soon changed its subtitle into Chronicle of Artistic Life in its second issue of 1920, and again in 1923 into Chronicle of Artistic and Literary Life, which better addressed its new orientation towards literature. Furthermore, it abandoned its sleek color covers reproducing woodcuts by different artists such as Paul Zustans, Léon Spillard, André Derain, Jean Naves, Joseph Cantré, Georges Crétin and Frits van den Berge, and from 1922 onwards kept reproducing the Harlequin woodcut by Gustave Desmet that appeared on its very first cover. This turn to literature not only reflects the literary persuasion of its editors, but also coincides with the second phase of Selection, which lasted until 1927, and is marked by the closure of the art gallery and the relocation of the magazine's offices from Brussels to Antwerp, that is to say, the Flemish region of Belgium, from where both of its editors came, de Ridder from Antwerp and Van Hecke from Ghent. From 1927 to 1933, during its third phase, Selection adopted a new format. It transformed into a monographic series, usually referred to as cahiers, each devoted to a single contemporary artist from Belgium or abroad. Having announced the publication of at least 22 cahiers Selection, the editors eventually published 14 booklets before the discontinuation of the magazine in 1933. In the meantime, Selection published a series of tracts, mainly consisting of studies on modern art by regular contributors to the magazine, such as the French art critic André Salmon, its general secretary Georges Marlier, and the two editors. The title alone of the journal is telling, for Selection was eclectic in its content. It defended artists working under the influence of Cubism, Expressionism, and later Surrealism, but supported those artists who achieved a Cubist Expressionist synthesis. Flemish Expressionism was described by the reader as constructive Expressionism, conciliating two opposing streams, Rationalism and Figurative Expressionism. This combination was traced in works by not only Flemish, but also French, Russian, and more rarely British artists, and was interpreted as characteristic of Nordic mentality. The selection of the artists for the monographic cahier is symptomatic of this eclecticism. Each one of the three phases of Selection carries its own significance and goes hand in hand with the activities of Van Hecke and de Ridder, as well as the changes in economic status that they faced throughout its publication. Apart from their Flemish origin, the two editors came from different social backgrounds, but shared important artistic, literary and socialist acquaintances dating back to 1909, when they first met. This presentation focuses almost entirely on the reader, who is the one to introduce the concept Les Génies du Nord that I seek to examine here, and the one who remains still in the shadow of Van Heke's multifaceted activity. A university professor of statistics and finance, the reader held teaching positions in Antwerp before his appointment as full professor at the University of Ghent in 1922. His academic career started at the same time when he launched the magazine and the gallery Selection with Van Heke. Prior to his engagement with the arts, the reader had marked important innovations in the literary domain. He is considered to have introduced to Flemish literature the genres of psychological biography and literary interview, as well as aspects of French dilettantism. Since 1905, he was a literary critic and later editor of the Flemish francophone daily La Métropole, while he also published his own novels in the literary journal Vlaams Arbeid. He also published interviews, critical and biographical studies on several writers such as Stijn Streuvels, Hugo Verriest, Paul de Montt, Jean de La Fontaine, Rémy de Gourmont, and others. Historians of Belgian literature are well aware of the reader and Van Heke's role in the activities of the so-called Orchard Group, associated with the Dante's literary journal De Boomgaard from 1909 to 1911. The group sought to introduce radical aspects of cosmopolitanism in Flemish literature and culture, going beyond the aspirations of the late 19th century Flemish Art Nouveau Van Nu en Straks group, which translates as today and tomorrow. The reader's turn to the artistic domain is very well explained by his activity during the Great War. He fled Belgium to the neutral Netherlands, where he stayed until the end of the hostilities. There, he established contacts with Belgian artists who found refuge in the Netherlands, such as Gustave de Smet and Frits van den Berge, and became familiar with the work of the Second St. Martin's Latin group, a colony of artists in East Flanders. In the Netherlands, he also met the French Cubist artist Henri Le Fauconnier, who also stayed there during the war, and became acquainted with the constructivist ideas that were developing in Amsterdam. Constant Permeke, prominent member of the Latin group, stayed in England. These contacts among expressionists and cubists proved fundamental to the formation of Flemish constructive expressionism that the reader promoted in Selection after the war. Catherine Verleysen traces a classic phase in the work of the second Latin group, which is interpreted as symptomatic of the call to order concept promoted by the French Salon cubist André Lotte and the influence by Léopold Survaz, Fernand Léger, and the purists Aux Enfants and Le Corbusier in the early 1920s. This classic phase, which climaxes around 1925, coincides with the reader's book Les Génies du Nord, which unfolds his ideas regarding a new classicism in the northern regions of Western Europe, mainly Belgium and France. The book was published in Antwerp and mainly consisted of essays previously published in Selection between 1923 and 1924. The first essay of the series was titled From the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Sea, the second, The Dangers of Neoclassicism, and the third, The Northern Soul. The book included one more chapter under the title On the Belgian March, which clearly formulates the idea that nationalism is the only path towards internationalism. This position draws from an earlier well-known dictum by August Vermeulen, founder of Van Nu en Straks group, which was, "We want to be Flemings in order to be Europeans." The reader described Belgium as a cultural crossroad, a land of invasion from the north, the south, and the east that incorporates foreign influences in order to enrich its own identity. Belgium is described as a distinct formation between Gaul and Germania at the crossroads leading from England to Italy, from France to Russia, through England. These are the same qualities that define the identity of Flemish Expressionism, which was a local style of international importance, according to the reader. In the first chapter of the book, the reader conceptualized the idea of a modern Northern classicism. The time, he wrote, has not yet come for us to enjoy the comfort of certitude and repose on categorical imperatives. We are in full research, and the more we search, even without finding, and open new paths, the more we will deserve a new future, when we will succeed in creating a new art, unconcerned with outdated formulas, which in a few decades or centuries from now will end up being a new classicism, which is our own and belongs to us. The reader rightly uses the term genius on his book title, a term introduced by Madame de Staël in the past to indicate transcendence of national boundaries. As Anne Jefferson noted, persons of genius are always compatriots amongst themselves, and despite their nationality, they are geared to understand and admire each other's qualities. Before its publication, the reader's book was advertised as a critique of regionalism in terms of the Latin and Hellenic ideals and the neoclassical aspirations that had been revived in contemporary art and thought. It proposed a modern international culture of Nordic character, while it also promised a whole new program for Belgian art. It is interesting that the reader could very well have conceived his ideas presented in the book at about the same time when the Nordic Society Association, the Nordische Gesellschaft, was founded in 1921 in Germany, aiming to strengthen German-Nordic cooperation. However, the reader appears very conscious with regards to the ideological projections of his ideas, constantly emphasizing their apolitical and cosmopolitan nature. The reader overtly expresses his disapproval of the revival of both the Latin and the Germanic order in radical nationalist contexts, namely in France and Belgium. It is under the cloak of the Mediterranean ideal, he explained, and the neoclassical nationalism that the clichés of academicism are being reintroduced into our thinking. German neo-romanticism, on the other hand, erroneously called expressionism, with its lack of equilibrium and order, its destructive and pessimist character, found no place in the reader's vision. However, the Latin spirit and Southern influence was deemed more dangerous than the German neo-romanticism, mainly because the reader's northern genius concept involved exchanges between the northern regions of France and Belgium rather than Germany. Apart from Flemish expressionist artists, Selection promoted painters coming from the northern regions of France, initially working under the influence of Fauvism and subsequently shifting towards Cubism, as well as Paris-based Russian artists such as Osip Zadkin, Mark Chagall and Vasily Kandinsky, employing an expressionist, cubist or abstract idiom, and finally the British vorticist Edward Wadsworth and the Germans Willy Baumeister and Max Ernst. This selection of painters roughly designates the reader's mental map of the northern genius. The book received little attention by the contemporary press. However, ideas encasing North-South antagonisms kept resurfacing in Selection until 1929. One of the tracts published by Selection was The Quarrel of Living Art by the General Secretary of the Review, Georges Marlier, in 1929. The first part of this tract constitutes a eulogy to deformation, in which Marlier attempts to legitimize the universal standing of Expressionism in the face of Hellenic art and its revival and influence over 4 centuries of European painting. Expressionism, according to him, is the continuation of the most ancient and universal traditions carrying the influence of Egyptian, Japanese, Chinese, Persian, African, Byzantine, Roman, and Gothic art. Marlier traces in Expressionism a universal need for formal deformation rooted deeply in the most ancient traditions which existed before and continued to exist after the culmination and decay of the classic Greek civilization. The 5th Cahiers Sélection dedicated to Léger in February 1929 included an article under the title North-South, signed by the Greek-born art critic Teriad. The text focuses on the Mediterranean spirit of Cubism through the example of the classic qualities of Picasso, Braque and Juan Gris, which are opposed by the Nordic spirit of Léger, who represents a classic phase in the evolution of Nordic art, according to Teriad. This distinction is made evident through the comparison between Picasso and Léger. Picasso is the liberator and Léger the constructor. Teriad expresses faith in the concept of a northern classicism in this text and employs relevant references to Nordic mentality in texts published elsewhere, such as his book on Léger and his articles about Louis Marcoussis, catering to the reader's idea. There is little doubt that the reader's anticipation of a northern classicism is inscribed in the widespread discussion of the call to order concept that has marked the immediate period after the Great War. However, Les Génie du Nord, though it was presented as a critique of regionalism, it introduced in reality a Nordic regionalist rhetoric interpreted in terms of cosmopolitanism and classicism. The reader sought to dissociate France from its Latin past and stress its Nordic identity, which was shared in common with Belgian Flanders. Considering the role of Paris as an artistic metropolis, it is interesting that the reader sought to legitimize the role that Flanders played in the evolution of French culture by reducing southern influences to sterile academicism. Aspiring to shift the paradigm from literature to art, from Flemish francophone literature to painterly constructive expressionism, the reader sought to set the foundations for an international Nordic culture which found parallels in examples of artistic and literary exchanges between France and Belgium from the Middle Ages to his own time, that he cited generously in his book. Sélection became the vehicle for dissemination of the reader's ideas, attempting to impose Flemish expressionism as an international Nordic current and the ideas of a universal Nordic culture in an international setting, although the reader appears to be mainly concerned with the reception of his ideas in France. Thank you very much.